agreements are called free trade agreements, but that's a misnomer. That's not what they are. They're really investor right agreements, and they do permit and insist upon capital mobility, but they don't allow labor mobility. So you have free capital mobility over the world. Countries are not allowed to control their own capital resources. On the other hand, people can't move. That's called an immigration crisis. This is entirely contrary to the principles of free trade. If anybody bothered to read Adam Smith, for example, he insists that free circulation of labor, free movement of working people, is a foundation of free trade. Otherwise, you have something, but it's not free trade. So these agreements, and in many respects, this is not the only one, they're designed for investor rights and not for the rights of people. Those don't matter. And you can see the effects. So one of the effects over time is a concentration of wealth in management, ownership, some of the professional classes and so on, but a deterioration in the status of working people almost everywhere. China is one of the examples. Well, you can gain some real insight. If you want to really understand the Cold War, the natural place to look is what happened in 1989. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, Cold War is over. So what happened? Well, that's quite interesting. First thing that happened is this was President Bush the First was in office at the time. His administration immediately came out with a new national security strategy and a new budget to reflect the fact that the Soviet Union was collapsing, no more Cold War. Well, the terms, the elements of it are very revealing. Never discussed, but very revealing. Maybe never discussed because they're very revealing, but you can check. The basic principles were that everything's going to remain the same, but the pretexts will change. So we must maintain a huge military force, not to protect ourselves against the Russians anymore because they're not there, but because of what they called the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now, nobody laughed. You're not supposed to laugh at serious things. So now we need a huge military force to protect ourselves from the technological sophistication of third world powers. We need massive intervention forces directed at the Middle East, and not because the Russians are coming, but for a different reason, because of radical nationalism, independent nationalism. And in fact, the new strategy said that the problems in the Middle East, the serious problems that the U.S. faced in the Middle East, I'm quoting, could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. They were not anything to do with the Russians. So apologies, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now we have a new world. Can't lie about that anymore. So we have to tell the truth. The problems are independent nationalism, as they always were, in fact, and so they remain. We must retain what was called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism, which means high-tech industry. Contrary to neoliberal free trade principles, the U.S. economy, like other advanced economies, depends crucially on the state sector, dynamic state sector. The IT revolution, computers and the internet, airplanes, commercial airplanes, go on and on. Much of it depends on the state sector, and a lot of it was developed under the pretext that it's defense. So the Pentagon was funding the basic, the hard, costly, risky parts of the high-tech revolution, meaning the taxpayer was paying for it on the pretext that it's defense against the Russians. Okay, Russians are gone, but we must maintain the defense industrial base, meaning high-tech industry, meaning the state sector of the economy. And so it continues. Essentially what the post-war, that planning said is, well, everything's the same without the Russians. Now we need new pretexts, and new pretexts were not long in coming. Well, NATO was interesting. If you believed Cold War propaganda, NATO should have been disbanded. NATO was there to protect us from the Russians. no Russians. So what happened? NATO expanded. It didn't disband. And in an interesting way, Gorbachev, Russian premier, he made an amazing concession in 1990. He agreed to let a unified Germany join NATO, a hostile military alliance. Now, if you think of the history of the 20th century, that's pretty remarkable. Germany alone had almost destroyed Russia twice in the century. And here Gorbachev was agreeing to let NATO be reunified, rearmed, and join a hostile military alliance. Well, there was a quid pro quo. The United States promised that NATO would not expand, as they put it, 1 inch to the east, meaning it would not expand to East Germany, and of course there was no thought of its expanding beyond. Now, the Bush administration was clever enough not to put that into writing. Those were verbal promises, very clear and explicit verbal promises. I might say that the diplomatic history of this period has been very well researched. We know just what happened. So they made a gentleman's agreement. And Gorbachev naively took it literally. He assumed that you could take the word of the gentleman who you're dealing with, and he didn't pay attention to the fact that they didn't bother to write it down on paper. So very quickly, especially under Clinton, NATO began to expand to the east, to East Germany, and then beyond to Eastern Europe. And the Russians, of course, bitterly complained, but the U.S. Objected, and accurately, that they'd never written it down on paper. So it was just a gentleman's agreement, and if you're naive enough to take the word of the gentleman you're making agreements with, well, that's your problem. But we're within our rights to expand NATO. So NATO expanded to the east, and it's expanded far beyond. By now it carries out military actions in areas nowhere near Europe. In fact, Europe is now being condemned by the United States. It's goodbye Europe, because they're not participating eagerly enough in U.S. invasions elsewhere, like in Afghanistan. And furthermore, it goes beyond. The Secretary General of NATO happened to be Dutch, and he informed NATO that it must expand globally to cover pipelines and sea lanes for the world energy system. So NATO must become a U.S. intervention force which controls the world energy system. No more defense against the Russians. That was a pretext we can forget about, and it's sort of gone from history. I don't want to talk about things that don't fit doctrine very well. In the newspapers this morning, you'll read that there's a new proposal from the United States to extend NATO even beyond. But now the reality of the world is being recognized more accurately. The clouds kind of lifted after the Soviet Union disappeared, and you can, if you want, see more clearly what drives policy. Well, without going into many examples, let me turn to the Middle East. It's within this context, this global context, that U.S. relations with Israel, which are another element of exceptionalism, they're unique in the world, in which this is the context in which they developed. The primary shift was in 1967. In 1967, Israel gave a major gift to the United States and to its primary ally, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is, of course, because that's where the oil is. In fact, one very good Middle East scholar, Gilbert Ashkar, has a new book in which he observes in passing that the U.S. relation with Saudi Arabia will remain of primary significance as long as one drop of oil remains in the Saudi desert. After that, it's finished. And that essentially captures the relationship. As you know, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were, in fact, at war at that time in the Yemen, and there was a